Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for Bridges Lunch Break event. My name is Kathy Kaliszewski. I'm the executive editor of Innovation here at Bridge, Michigan, your source for nonprofit, nonpartisan news. So back in February, a month into the Trump administration, we had reporters Ron French and Lauren Gibbons, led by Deputy Editor Jonathan Oosting, to talk about what they were seeing related to the policies and executive orders being initiated by the Trump administration and its impact here in Michigan. Well, we're 5 months into the Trump's presidency, and a lot has happened between tariffs, federal spending cuts, and a lot more. So we figured it made sense to bring this team back, along with data reporter Mike Wilkinson, to break down what's been going on. We're recording today's conversation, and it will be posted on Bridge Michigan's website this week. While there, you can subscribe to our newsletters by visiting www.bridgemi.com and clicking the Sign Up tab. Events like this one are made possible by support of Bridge members. If you'd like to join this membership community, we'll drop the link in the chat. A reminder, we ask you to stay muted throughout the conversation. And if you have questions for our panelists, please drop them in the chat. We'll get to as many as possible before the hour is up. So now I'm going to pass it over to Jonathan to get us started.
Well, hello, everybody. Thanks again for joining us. Really excited for this conversation. Hope it's a good one. I assume a lot of you have read a lot of our coverage at Bridge, Michigan, specifically about the Trump administration so far here in the president's second term. But just a quick brief overview. Bridge, our mission is Michigan-focused news. So if we cover the big, beautiful bill, we're not going to cover necessarily all the machinations in Congress, but we're going to look at what would the policy implications be for Michigan. That's really our bread and butter and our focus. So we're not, we haven't necessarily reported on every story from DC, but when we see there's an obvious or significant impact on Michigan, we are jumping in. A lot of that coverage has been led by the folks you see on this Zoom today. Lauren Gibbons, one of our Capitol correspondents, Ron French, who was instrumental in our early coverage of this second Trump term, and Mike Wilkinson, who's been doing some great fact-checking work for us and revisiting promises that President Trump made to Michigan voters in his successful 2024 election. So before we get into the really specific Michigan stuff, there's an elephant in the room. The situation in Iran and the conflict with Iran and Israel, which the U.S. Perhaps briefly joined this weekend with airstrikes. There was an apparent ceasefire, but maybe not. Tensions are certainly still very high. Lauren, from a Michigan perspective, how are officials here reacting, and is there any other direct impact on Michigan at this time?
I think just like everyone else in the country and probably the world, there's still a lot that we're waiting to learn about. We saw in initial reactions coming out of the Michigan delegation of Congress that kind of split along partisan lines, as you might expect. Trump allies, were said they were ready for the debriefing. They said they believed in Trump's quote peace through strength policy is how the Republicans have been dubbing it. But then the main criticism that's been brought up by many Democrats, including several in the Michigan delegation, is did Trump have the authority to do this without Congress? They have been expecting a briefing in Congress in both the House and Senate, although I did just see some reports that those briefings have been delayed. But we'll see what happens. I think there's still so much that we're waiting to hear about from both the administration, how it plays out in the Middle East, and just what exactly the next steps will be.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Mike, you've been, as I mentioned, leading our sort of fact check team on promises that Trump made to Michigan voters in 2024. Remind us, what did he say about the Middle East?
Well, most of his focus in Michigan was about the economy, inflation, auto jobs, but he did mention the Middle East at least once when he was in Hamtramck for a brief stop to get the endorsement of the mayor there. He said, we want peace in the Middle East. We're going to get peace in the Middle East. Right now it's, you mentioned, is the ceasefire taking hold? Look at the New York Times or the Washington Post. You have to look every 5 minutes. It currently says shaky ceasefire takes hold under pressure from Trump. But is that peace? We've seen in Gaza that there were attempts by the president to tout the wonder that could be the waterfront development in Gaza, and it looks like right now it's just a desolate wasteland that keeps getting more destroyed, and millions are potentially staring at starvation. I'm not sure if that's the definition of peace, but we are 5 months in. If the actions in Iran do lead to a lasting peace, he probably would get some credit for that.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. The president, of course, also talked about very quickly being able to end the Ukraine-Russian war, and that's proven complicated. I think it's fair to say that some of his proclamations, at least about solving these, international conflicts quickly, has proven much more complicated, perhaps, than he made clear on the campaign trail. But he would not be the first politician to make a broad promise about a complicated issue. So it's not necessarily a direct connection, but Lauren, Trump did last month announce some seemingly good news for Michigan's defense industry. I think you were there, right, Lauren? It was quite a scene. The president and Governor Gretchen Whitmer on stage together announcing some plans for Selfridge Air National Guard Base. Can you remind us what that is and what it might mean for Michigan?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was actually at the rally. I was not there for the exact announcement, but I did cover it, of course. So this has been a big issue for Michigan for a long time. Selfridge Air National Guard Base has a fleet of retiring jets, and there was some question about whether the federal government would put a new fleet in to make use of this space and to protect some of these military jobs there. And so President Trump, along, as you mentioned, with Governor Gretchen Whitmer, announced at the base that there'll be 21 F-15EX Eagle II fighters that are going to be coming in to replace that retiring fleet. He, at the time, said he was laying to rest any doubts that there was going to be activity at that base. But this has been something that's been a bipartisan issue for quite some time. Both Republicans and Democrats have said it protects a lot of jobs in this area. It's a big economic impact, both for the employees and also just for the related businesses in the area. So it was a pretty significant announcement, and it was one of those Trump Whitmer connections where there has been some discourse about that. I'm sure we'll get into it later in the conversation.
Yeah, that's been pretty interesting to watch. Ron, one other area of common ground that the governor and president, the governor, of course, a Democrat, the president, a Republican, have found so far is seemingly on Asian carp. Can you tell us about what they announced there and how significant that could be for the state?
Sure, it could be a huge deal for Michigan. I don't think I have to tell anyone on this call that what a disaster it would be if Asian carp spread into the Great Lakes. They're a threat to walleye, perch, whitefish. There are places in the Mississippi River Basin where 90% of the fish are now Asian carp. There's been a lot of efforts for years to try to build barriers to keep Asian carp from getting into the lakes. Once they're there, it's going to be a problem getting them out. There have been certainly a lot of issues around that, including funding. Well, a big deal. It's a really big deal that Whitmer and I think it's significant to say her counterpart, the Republican House Speaker Matt Hall, when they were at the White House this spring, brought up this issue, and then fairly soon afterward, President Trump decided to move forward with some federal funding and some easing of paperwork that needed to be done, including environmental restrictions and things like that, to help build these barriers in a quicker way. It's a big deal, and it is another example of despite some of the criticism that the governor has received for working for, closely with Trump in some situations, where it looks as if it may be paying some dividends.
So this is, of course, still a really big divide in the Democratic Party, the Michigan Democratic Party, Michigan Democrats writ large. The approach they should or are taking with Trump. Lauren, you've covered both the governor and Attorney General Dana Nessel. She's taking a very different approach to Donald Trump, and you talked to her about that. What'd she say, and what are you seeing from her?
Yeah, absolutely. From the Attorney General's perspective, she is taking a very similar approach to what she took during Donald Trump's first term, which is challenging a lot of the administration's moves to cut funding, to unilaterally stop a lot of investments in Michigan and other states. So there has been, at least initially, they have managed to stop or at least pause while it goes through the court process some of these most significant funding cuts. But it has been a very different approach, yes, to what Governor Whitmer has been doing, which is working with Trump where she can, stating her piece on a couple of specific issues. She certainly made clear about her concerns with some of the proposals pending in Congress with SNAP and Medicaid. But on other issues, she either hasn't said much or, has been willing to work with the president. And, our colleague Simon Schuster also wrote about this recently when there was many protests throughout the state. You saw Attorney General Dana Nessel and other Democratic politicians attending some of these protests, rallying some of the anti-Trump fervor at these protests, but then, Governor Whitmer did not participate.
Yeah, they at first I thought maybe they were playing good cop, bad cop here, but there's been some like public elbows thrown here. Dana Nessel, the other month after Whitmer was working with Trump on a couple of these initiatives, then Trump said at a press conference, sort of out of the blue, he was asked about it, but would you consider pardoning the men that kidnapped Governor Whitmer? And he said, yeah, I'm thinking about that, or something along those lines. And Dana Nessel, publicly tweeted out shortly thereafter, the reward you get for cozying up to Trump is him threatening to pardon the terrorists who plotted to kidnap and murder you. And then she went on MSNBC and said some pretty critical comments about Whitmer believing Trump, saying he might not do that as well. So that's been really fascinating to watch. But for Whitmer, she's still got this kind of golden goose out there, something she really wants from Trump, and that's a fab. Ron, what's a fab? Are we going to get one?
I got to be honest, the first time I heard that, I thought they were talking about the Beatles. Shows you my age, but no, we're talking about a semiconductor fabrication plant, which would be a huge deal for Michigan. They're very large, they're very complex, very expensive. They also employ a lot of people, and it would really be a shot in the arm to our economy, which at times seems to be struggling. It would employ between 3,000 and 6,000 people, they think. And so it'd be a large deal. And one of the things that Whitmer has lobbied the Trump administration for is to try to get some backing from them, including federal funding, for this type of fab plant, this fabrication plant. And it's really potentially there, to be honest. There's funding set aside in the CHIPS Act, which was passed, during the administration of Joe Biden for this sort of thing. The money's there. It's just a question of whether it's used and whether it's used in Michigan. So I think the governor's looking at it as a possibility that if it's going to happen, we want to get it done. And she obviously wants to try to get it done while she is still governor.
Yeah, at the same time, congressional Republicans have sort of openly, brought up the idea that they might try and claw back some of that money. So it's very much up in the air. I think whether, that money exists right now on paper, but so has a lot of money for other, climate change initiatives and things like that the Trump administration or congressional Republicans have worked pretty aggressively to try and claw back. So real quick, one more Whitmer thing. I think a lot of people are interested in this. Whitmer has criticized some Trump policies or proposals, but not necessarily naming Trump, but at least criticizing the underlying policy proposal. Lauren, what are some of those, and why do you think the governor is speaking out on those particular issues and not necessarily others that Dana Nessel is?
Right. I definitely think the governor's administration is choosing to pick their battles, and one of those is the quote unquote big beautiful bill, this reconciliation bill that's percolating in Congress right now. She's very concerned about the implications for Michigan, especially when it comes to SNAP food assistance and Medicaid. Especially, I think for the SNAP issue, that does have pretty big budget implications as the governor and the legislature start putting together state funding. If they're losing a ton of money from the federal government, then states will have to determine how much they contribute, what happens, and that's a pretty big hole, especially when they need to get a budget done by October 1st at the latest. So that's one big thing. She's also made pretty clear that she would like to see a different direction on tariffs. With the auto industry in Michigan, that's an issue that a lot of Michigan companies are very concerned about. We're a border state. We've got the Gordie Howe Bridge opening later this year. It's a big deal for Michigan if Canada trade tensions are happening, not to mention all of the other countries that Michigan does business with. So that's another area of concern for their administration.
For sure. Tariffs, certainly in the early parts of this term, at least, were all anyone was talking about. There's maybe been some other things going on lately. But obviously some big implications for Michigan there. What are we seeing any impact, directly in Michigan at this point from the, tariff whiplash, as we've called it at times in the newsroom?
Yeah, definitely. So researchers at both MSU and U of M have been looking at this over the last month or so. They have come up with some data. At MSU found that the taxes on Canadian imports were 19 times higher in April than they were in January. And also noticing some pauses both by businesses and consumers in investing in things and expanding operations and buying new products or keeping certain products stocked if they're not sure they're going to sell. So that's on the business side. But then on the consumer side as well, some University of Michigan consumer survey data shows that that's happening for the average American too. They are concerned that if tariffs get much higher, if costs are affecting, their ability to spend, they're probably waiting to buy that new car or take any risks or even, reducing their own personal spending habits. And all of that could end up having a pretty big implication for the economy.
I want to point out that in some ways, the tariffs are having some of what at least Trump had said was his intended impact. You have GM, who has brought some production into the state, into, I think, the Orion plant. Ford and other Toyota, they are bringing production here to avoid those tariffs. Whether that wipes out the negative impact of higher prices is unknown, but one of the goals that he saw, at least in some of these big companies, is working out. Maybe they were planning to do this already, but they would argue that the business community is taking note of the tariffs, and they definitely are.
Yeah, that is an important point. And then also I'll quickly mention that there was before the tariffs really started getting into effect, there was kind of a surge in people trying to avoid the tariffs. So, we saw a little bit of a spike before The biggest tariffs started going into effect this spring, where people were just hearing the news and starting to buy a lot of stuff at the get-go. So, we still there's still a lot to be determined. July is when the pause on a lot of these reciprocal tariffs is tentatively expiring. So there's going to be a lot more news later this summer.
Yeah, thank you. There's been a lot of prognostications, of course, about what tariffs could mean, potential job losses for Michigan, according to Michigan State University economists. But at the same time, what are we actually seeing in the data, Mike? How's Michigan doing economically? That was a big part of Trump's promise to Michigan. He promised a miracle here, right?
Yeah, he came into the state, and it was probably the top state he visited, and that was his top message. Detroit's automakers we're going to be returned to glory. We're going to see the jobs that we saw 50, 60 years ago, which kind of ignores all the automation that happened since then, in addition to the loss of trade. But as what's happening on the ground, there's two pictures, right? You've got what's going on nationally and what's going on in Michigan. The inflation rate, it started to go up, but just a tiny amount. It's still outside of last month, it's the lowest level since February of 2021. That hasn't affected there yet, even though the economists, both left and right, anticipate that those tariffs will start hitting the consumer and they will start raising prices. But so far, that hasn't happened. But in Michigan, we have an unemployment rate, just came out this morning, of 5.4%. Where the only Nevada has a worse unemployment rate than Michigan. And one thing that has happened in the last 12 months or 18 months is that Michigan has become disconnected from the national picture, right? Years ago, we always had a couple points more unemployment than the nation. When the nation got a cold, we got the flu, was the old story. And then during COVID, that gap narrowed. Well, in the last year, no state has seen its unemployment rate grow more. It grew 0.9, and the gap between us and the national rate is 1.2 percentage points. That's double what it was a year ago. So, for all the talk that we're bringing these jobs back, the unemployment numbers are showing otherwise. But I'm sure it's, maybe when the jobs come from wherever they were before and show up in Lake Orion or Marshall or wherever, maybe that'll have an impact. But right now, again, Michigan's unemployment rate is second highest in the nation. But again, on the other side, consumer confidence has surprisingly increased in the last month. One of the biggest things, the seventh largest jump in the last since 2000. It had gone down steadily since the election to one of the lowest levels since the bottom of COVID, but it rebounded in the last month. Is it going to continue? I don't know. We've got a lot of things going on. Are people going to feel confident when they start seeing the tariff prices? I don't know. But when it comes to the economy, Michigan voters voted, I'm going to guess, mostly on that, perhaps also immigration. And there's a lot of data out there that tells us it's not going perfect in Michigan, but going better in the United States.
Thanks, Mike. We've broached the topic a little bit already, but the so-called big, beautiful bill passed the House. I think it was last month. Senate's debating possible changes to it. We don't know exactly where it's going to land yet, but Lauren, as of the version that passed the House, I know it's a big bill, right? But what are some of the things that it could mean for Michigan?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot going on. And as you mentioned, the Senate is considering some pretty significant changes. But generally speaking, what the Trump administration and his allies in Congress want to do is extend tax cuts that were included in his first term tax package. They want to create other tax breaks, including expanding the child tax credit. There's several different tax breaks in the bill. Also really trying to get rid of some of the Biden era clean energy credits, EV situations. And then, of course, the big elephant in the room that we have already talked about to some extent is the cutting of spending on public assistance programs like Medicaid and food stamps. And those are the issues that Democrats have really focused on in their criticism of the bill. Some of these changes would be very significant, and could make the changes a net negative for lower income individuals and families, even with all of the proposed tax cuts that are being involved in there. So where it lands, it kind of just depends on what some of these debates in the Senate are going through. But the Republicans are really trying to push this through, and that could have big implications, not just for individuals who may see some tax breaks, but also if you are benefiting from Medicaid or SNAP, could see some pretty drastic changes. But also, as I mentioned earlier, the state budget implications. A lot of this is federal funding that goes to the states first, so that could put a big dent in the state budget as well.
Yeah, I mean, Medicaid is huge in Michigan. I think it's something like 3 out of every 8 residents in the state get their health coverage, health benefits through Medicaid. And that was, of course, expanded under Republican Governor Rick Snyder through the Obamacare Healthy Michigan program. So, yeah, it's a really big deal. A lot of folks, not only people on those assistance programs, but hospitals and medical providers that provide care are watching that really, really closely. Let's turn to another really hot topic, immigration, charge topic here. Mike, Trump, of course, promised a mass deportation effort. Has he done that?
Well, he's given an old college try. I mean, he came in here, besides talking about the economy, he said he was going to secure the borders. He blamed immigration for housing problems in Michigan. He blamed it for crime, Michigan and elsewhere. But what he has done when he got into office, he's done exactly what he said he was going to do. He's militarized the border to the cries of outrage from the left. He has increased substantially his administration through ICE and Kristi Noem and Tom Homan, the number of removals and expulsions. And at the same time, there have been a lot of complaints that due process has gone out the window along with those immigrants. There have been multiple court cases involving people who have been removed who were legally allowed to be here. So he did what he said. And if you look at what happened, I mean, in the Biden administration, they ramped up expulsions and removals, but not really until last year in the election year. If you look at 2020 through 2023, they did not do much, and that kind of opened the door to people to say that there's a big problem. The census started acknowledging there were like more than 2 million more immigrants in the nation. So what Mr. Trump or President Trump and the right had been saying for a long time kind of came to fruition in terms of the number of people and then the ramping up of removal. So whether he will succeed in sending people to El Salvador or South Sudan or wherever, there has been a substantial decline in the number of people who are even trying to come across the border. So you might not like it, but he's doing what he said, and there's a good argument that that was one of the reasons people supported him.
Folks, Lauren, I'm going to pivot to her real quick because she just published a story. If you haven't seen it yet, which I'm guessing you haven't because it was like 15 minutes before this Zoom started, published a story on a big new ICE detention center that's opening in Baldwin, Michigan, or is open in Baldwin, Michigan. She can confirm that. Lauren, tell us about that. How did that come to be? How did a small town in rural Michigan end up with what could be one of the biggest ICE deportation detention facilities in the country?
Yeah, absolutely. So this facility is owned by a private company, Geo Group. They own several private prisons around the country, and it's been vacant for a few years, and there have been periods of inactivity throughout the course of its history since the facility opened in 1999. But most recently, the Biden administration canceled a lot of its private prison contracts, including this Geo Group contract. So the idea had been floated for this to be an ICE detention center. Previously, it hadn't really gained much traction until this year when the Trump administration began working with Geo Group and other private organizations to to open detention centers and expand ICE capacity. As Mike was mentioning, ramping up deportation efforts, they didn't have the space for all these people. So they are working at opening some of these facilities around the country. And the Baldwin facility is pretty large. It has the capacity for 1,800 beds. We don't exactly know just yet whether they are going to be operating at full capacity, if that's the expectation, or somewhere in between. But, if it is operating at full capacity, it will certainly be the largest in the Midwest, but it has the potential to be among the largest in the country. That there's it's a pretty rural area. There's a lot of concerns by critics that just the isolation and the fact that it's pretty far away from any of Michigan's major population centers could make it harder for detainees to get resources or legal counsel. But on the other hand, a lot of people are looking forward to the economic boon that this could be for a very rural, high unemployment area. So there's a lot of it's a pretty big deal for Michigan, and yeah, it could put Michigan on the map of some of these immigration conversations happening nationally.
Thanks, Lauren. Folks, if you have any questions, any other questions about that topic or other topics we're discussing today, a reminder, drop your questions in the chat. We are going to reserve some time in the second half of this call for reader and audience questions, so drop them there. Ron, Mike mentioned Trump is, whether you agree with it or not, doing what he said, or trying to do what he said he would do with these mass deportation effort. But he's also gone beyond just illegal immigration. He's also challenged the status of some, or his administration has anyways, of some immigrants already here legally, including university students. So you've covered this issue from the get-go, including an initial wave of student visa revocations. What happened there? What's the status of those students or visa programs right now?
Sure, absolutely. And for those who may not be familiar with it, this is a big issue for particularly University of Michigan and Michigan State. Michigan State has about 4,500 international students. U of M has 8,000. That's about 17% of their total student population. Yeah, it's a big concern. And the first note that people had this was going to be a concern here came in April, when there were 70 or so international students at universities across Michigan that received notice of potential deportation. It wasn't clear what, in all cases, why they were singled out. In a lot of cases, it had to do with them having some sort of contact with police. Didn't mean there was ever a conviction, but if there was some sort of record of them having some contact with police, that was rescinded. But it was sort of like marked the beginning of a movement. Later on, the Trump administration actually halted all student visa applications. That has picked up again. It's resumed, but with the caveat that they are asking international students to make all their social media platforms open to the public, with the intention that federal officials can look at those social media apps and see if those students are expressing anti-US views. There's obviously some concerns along the way. I'm sure it's going to be fought in court. That being said, students are scheduled to be back in classes at the end of August. So it's a big challenge for these students and for the universities. I can tell you that Michigan State University advised its international students to not go home over the summer, to just stay in East Lansing, thinking that will make it easier so they can't get stopped at the border when they come back in. But anyway, it's all up in the air now, whether these are sort of threats, or whether we'll actually start seeing stories in August or September of some PhD students at University of Michigan being stopped from coming back. We don't know yet. But we do know that it is something that the universities are quite concerned about, and certainly all of us should be. Obviously, this came up both because of Trump's positions on immigration and protests at universities such as Columbia. Um, but also, we have to acknowledge some of these international students become national residents. They decide to stay in the United States, have careers here, very successful careers, and families here. So, there's a pros and cons to this.
Mike, you reported on the latest developments, at least warnings from the Trump administration regarding Chinese students specifically. Do you have anything to add to what Ron said? You're on mute, Mike.
There we go. Sorry about that. One of the things I read recently was, the whole idea on going after specifically Chinese students was part of negotiating over rare earths, right? How many minerals that the United States can regain access to that are in the Chinese market. So you don't even know if it's really about these kids or if it's about something else. But the goal with the Chinese, the needle that they had to thread in China with the Chinese students was if they were tied to the Chinese Communist Party or if they were in critical fields. Now, not every person from China who comes here, would probably be covered. But there are a lot. I mean, Ron mentioned some of the numbers. I know at U of M, there's nearly 4,000 Chinese students alone. Though if you think about it, that's what, 39, that's 4,000 rent payments. That's how much food, how many groceries, how many cars. If someone mentioned that in the chat very early, it's not an inconsequential number, even in a town of Ann Arbor that has a lot of people. Western Michigan has 1,000 Chinese students. They've clearly made that those students something that they were seeking because they pay a higher rate of tuition and fees, and it can mean millions of dollars to help a university go forward. And now suddenly that might go away. Where I live across the street from a university, and it is very clear, Ron, that they took the advice. The foreign students are basically the entire workforce at the recreation center. Why go home and take a chance, right? You want to make sure you can come back.
Interesting. Thank you. Lauren, you've also reported pretty deeply on fears among other legal immigrants who are here, including Ukrainian refugees. What's the status of Ukrainian refugees and why are they scared, I guess?
Yeah, so I think with refugees or people coming from war-torn areas, they have a lot of different classifications depending on which country they're from. There are certain refugees who are here that are permanent residents just by nature of their visa, and they can, pursue permanency. There's a pretty clear path to permanent residence and eventual citizenship. For Ukrainians, they are among the countries that are here on what's called humanitarian parole. And that is usually a visa that you have to continue to get that renewed, usually about every 2 years or so. And the Biden administration, before Biden left office, he did renew that for another 2 years. But it's kind of unclear at this point what the Trump administration is going to do, whether he'll continue to renew that. There have been some countries where he has terminated humanitarian parole. There's not in Michigan, at least, Ukrainians would be the biggest population hit if the humanitarian parole was canceled for them or if they had to go back. But there's a lot of concern for a lot of these Ukrainian refugees. They don't have much to go back to in Ukraine, whether their properties have been destroyed or they have started their lives over at this point. I talked to a couple of Ukrainian families in Midland who were both in the restaurant business, left behind a lot of restaurants, and started a bakery in Midland and have kind of a booming business now. And they would love to stay. They'd love to, pursue, permanent residence, but it's kind of in limbo at this point. because there just hasn't been any clear indication on what the future of their status will be.
Great, thank you. We are going to turn to audience questions in just a sec. I got one more question I'm going to pose to both Ron and Lauren, because they have covered pretty extensively sort of the impacts of Doge, Elon Musk, and other Trump administration efforts to cut spending on specific programs. Of course, the big beautiful bill we talked about earlier would, according to projections, actually increase the federal deficit much more than these cuts would reduce it. But nonetheless, these are pretty significant cuts and impacting a lot of programs in Michigan. So I just want to ask Ron and Lauren, who have reported a lot on these cuts, what do you think the most significant of these cuts could be for Michigan that you've reported on? Ron, let's start with you.
Sure. I'm going to go with something very specific, but I think it touches a lot of families, and that is the potential for a great deal of loss of federal funding for drug prevention, treatment, and recovery. So far, the state has lost $5.7 million in federal funding for this. It has the potential to lose $93 million, which is 31% of the total spent in the state on these sorts of services. The reason that's important, if it's not something that your family has dealt with yet, just with opioids alone, one Michigander dies every 5 hours from an opioid overdose. Even now, it used to be 1 in 4, so it's improving. We've made progress, but part of that progress is we're dumping a lot of money into this system, including federal funds are the primary funding for Narcan, which is it just literally brings people back to life who have had opioid overdoses. So there's a real challenge out there right now. There's a lot of concern about what that could mean for the state. Even the existing cuts already, there is a couple of medically assisted treatment services that have been shut down in the Upper Peninsula. There's there's a new facility, an in-treatment facility in Sault Ste. Marie that it's a $6 million project. And just about the time they were breaking ground, they were notified that they were losing $3 million of that money that was federal funds. So they're continuing to build for now, but they don't know how they'll be able to complete the project. So it's a big deal because we've made a lot of momentum, saving a lot of lives, and there's concern in the communities that this could blunt or reverse the progress we've made.
Lauren, same question.
I just want to have real
sorry,
quick. There's been a lot of progress made. We had a decline in the death rate last year that was nearly, was it 1,000 fewer or 800 fewer? And I think, the biggest reason is because it's the ubiquity of Narcan, which is unfortunate that anyone has to have it on them, but it is saving lives. And this fantastic decline in the death rate might be in jeopardy.
Lauren, same question. Most significant cuts that you've reported on in your opinion?
Yeah, I think from an overall hit to Michigan and potentially the future of Michigan, if all of the cuts, some of them are being challenged in court, but research funding, both at the university level and in the health industry, a lot of those projects that are grant funded, are creating a lot of jobs. They fuel the economy, but also it does it does ding some of the projects at some of these research institutions. Like MSU had a very long-standing partnership with USAID, for example, and they lost a ton of research that was ongoing about farming in some of these other African nations. But I think that's a pretty significant cut for Michigan. Some of those are being challenged. Some of that money is just gone, as far as people are aware. So that's a big deal for not just Michigan's major research institutions like MSU, U of M, Wayne State, et al. But in terms of the private sector, we've got a lot of research industry here in Michigan that could be really, really hard hit by these loss of funding.
Thanks, Lauren. A lot of our reader questions have touched on some of the topics we've mentioned before. but some really thoughtful questions nonetheless. Rusty C asked for comments on SNAP and Medicaid. I think we covered that already. So Rusty, if not, drop another question in the chat, and we'll get back to it. But another question came from George H. He asked, well, I'm interested in the NEA, the National Endowment for the Arts. I'm more interested in if secondary impacts have been estimated. So like if loses funding for research, for instance, is that going to mean have a ripple effect? I'm summarizing the question here. Sorry, George. But so broadly, NEA or any just research cuts in general, which are somewhat separate, what sort of ripple effects could these have on Michigan institutions or people? Anybody want to jump in on that?
Oh, yeah, I can answer that somewhat personally. I probably, shouldn't. I have a family member who actually solicits grants for public health at University of Michigan. And she's worried that they're not going to get, they're already going to online to get $53 million cut. That means people get cut. It means the research doesn't happen. This is research about drugs. It's about diseases. They don't occur. So there's the downstream effect. If we don't look and see what the problems are with why do African American men die more from prostate cancer, because the word African American we use, and that's a diversity buzzword. Maybe we don't find out how to solve that problem. But the real world thing, she anticipates that they'll have to lay off researchers. Where do they go? These are people with PhDs who live in Ann Arbor. Where are they going to go? They're going to go to another country. They're going to go to other states. So there are some real world impacts. That mean that individuals lose, but I guess we lose a body of knowledge as well.
Yeah, and I can touch on that as. Oh, sorry.
I'll be very short.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Then go to you, but one downstream effect of what Mike is talking about there, when you talk about cuts of research, it's very easy and obvious. We should point out, concerns about like medical research and how this could actually affect people's lives. Downstream from that, all these programs hire grad students who get their training doing this research to then go on to be researchers themselves and get a PhD and things like that. Those grad students are paid, and that's one of the big things. That's one of the first things that are going to be cut. And so you're talking about your next generation of researchers that could be impacted by this.
Yeah, and I was just going to very briefly touch on the NEA. I did some reporting on that. This could mean less plays or theaters or shows to go to, but that could also mean for the overall businesses around there. If you're going to a play, you're probably going to go to dinner first. There's so many residual effects to that. But I also spent some time at a program that offers art programs for people with disabilities in Metro Detroit area. They got a grant from the NEA. They were able to get most of that funding. But they are also very concerned about Medicaid, because for many of these people with disabilities, Medicaid helps them pay for some of these extracurricular activities that help get them into the community. And in a lot of these cases, they are making art that they're able to sell and provide income for themselves. So there's so many residual effects. It's not just the dollar on paper for a lot of these things. It does infiltrate into second, third, fourth degree.
Thank you. Another question came in from Mark. He wrote, I was in the UP recently and local businesses were saying that their business is down and that there's been a big drop in Canadian tourists coming to the UP. Is this anecdotal or is there any actual data on this? Lauren, do we know anything about that?
Yeah, so a couple of our colleagues, Janelle James, wrote a story about this in April. The research is showing that is correct. In March, the number of travelers crossing international borders into Michigan dropped 11%, and that was the second drop in as many months. That's according to U.S. Customs. And then car traffic was down 18% in March. So to your point, that does mean a lot to, for people, especially in border towns who rely on traffic between Michigan and Canada. Certainly in the UP, that's a big deal for Sault Ste. Marie and to surrounding towns. But, we also in Metro Detroit, that's a huge border crossing, a lot of trade implications there. But also, if tourism in the summer is such a huge driver of Michigan's economy. So any drop, from neighboring countries, that's that significant is of course having a residual effect on some of those tourism industries.
Okay, Lauren mentioned the Sioux, so I got to jump to the related reader question quick. Joe N asked, curious as to the status funding of the Sioux Locks project. I'll just note that Trump so far has released money that was already scheduled for that project. So not actively held it up in any way. Do we know anything else about that situation right now? Anybody on the panel that has any insights, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I can jump in again. They did as of last week, the third phase of funding was awarded. It's being built. It's still expected to be on schedule, opening in 2030. So as far as I'm aware at this stage, it seems to be running full steam ahead. They've continued to get funding, and they're going into phase 3.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Hugh. Hello, Hugh. Good to see you. Thank you for joining us. Hugh asks, Michigan communities get billions of pass-through federal dollars for long neglected health and environmental concerns like lead service line replacements, addressing PFAS, cleaning up contaminated brownfields and legacy sites in and near the Great Lakes, and monitoring water quality. For anybody on the panel, because as Hugh noticed, he asked, where's Kelly? Kelly, of course, is our awesome environmental reporter, Kelly House. She has been busy covering the state's whitefish crisis. You should read her excellent series this week. But she has done some good reporting on Trump administration impacts on the environment so far. But to our panelists here, what, if anything, have you heard about potential cuts to those funding streams for environmental initiatives? And are any Michigan Republicans making a fuss about that? I wish Kelly was here.
Yeah. That's a great future thing to talk about for sure.
Yeah, Kelly, of course, has done some good reporting on cuts that were going to impact sea lamprey efforts, to take care of that nefarious invasive. But a lot of this stuff, as you know, probably know, Hugh, you probably know a lot of this stuff better than we do. Hugh has worked on environmental issues for a while. Some of these things have been overturned by courts. People were fired who were gonna, lead this program and then reinstated. So it is kind of a gray area for us right now, I will admit. Hugh says you'll call Kelly. That's a great idea. Thank you.
I could also very briefly say, in the past, when there have been proposed cuts to Great Lakes funding, especially the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, Republicans have stepped in and have typically gone through that now. Whether that will happen again, J.D. Vance was one of the Midwest Republicans who in the past has supported the GLRI. That has perennially come up as an issue, and typically Great Lakes funding has made it through based on support in Congress from Republicans. So, TBD on whether it gets challenged in any major significant way again. But, historically, Great Lakes has been pretty bipartisan.
Great. One more question from our viewers here, and then we're going to go to a couple reader questions that were submitted before this. Quick one. We're going to do lightning round here. We've got just a few minutes left. So for anybody on the panel, is Michigan able to make up the differences in cost shifts from the federal level to the state or local level? Are rural areas hit the hardest if Michigan can't absorb the federal cuts? All this debate comes, of course, as Michigan lawmakers and the governor are trying to negotiate a new budget. Certainly complicates it. What else do we know, Lauren? if you're able, since you've covered Lansing.
Is Michigan able to make up the difference? No. That's the short answer. The long answer is if they wanted to reprioritize funds, they would have to make some pretty significant cuts in other areas.
Yeah, we don't have an exact figure for the potential Medicaid cut. Some of the projections that the Whitmer administration put out were based on an earlier version of the Big Beautiful Bill that didn't pass. But as far as like SNAP, for instance, the Whitmer administration is estimating a $900 million roughly hit for Michigan if they want to make up that difference. And while certainly budgets have grown under the governor in recent years, finding $900 million is no easy task, as lawmakers are learning now as they try and find money for a potential road funding deal. Another question here. Ron, can you talk about some of the impacts Trump administration policies or funding might have on rural school districts? I'm asking you that because you've long covered education issues in the state.
Sure, it's a very good question. I wish I had a good answer for it, but I was actually on the phone with a rural superintendent just this morning on another story that will be coming out soon, and I asked about this, and he said that the good news is there's been no impact so far on rural schools to cuts that have happened in other areas. But there's a lot of concern about what could happen down the road. There's concern about things like just the federal funding for school lunch and school breakfast programs, which are a big deal. That we have that in Michigan, but a lot of the money is federal funding. It'd be tough to go forward without the federal funding. There are potential cuts to Head Start, which is, a huge federal program for early childhood education. That's not specifically to rural schools, but it has an impact there as well as in all across the state. So it's a lot of things that people are like sort of war game planning, like what would we do if this money was lost? But at the moment, their budgets are okay.
Lauren, a reader named Julie asked, said she hopes Big Gretch, referring to the governor, Gretchen Whitmer, doesn't comply with ICE. And I think we can temporarily do without road money, she said. So this was a question about a Trump administration directive for, why don't you tell me what it was about, Lauren, and what's the status of that?
Absolutely. Yeah, so there was a directive sent out to state departments of transportation and any entity that was receiving money from the federal DOT, basically saying comply with our directives on DEI and ICE, or they were threatening cuts for funding that have already been in place, essentially. And so when I was talking to experts here in Michigan, they said the main areas of concern are probably the Biden era transportation initiatives that did already receive the funding. But the way that it was written, it could have been anything, right? It could have been like the formula that Michigan and other states get for contributing to maintenance of federal highways, which would be obviously a huge deal in Michigan, where our roads, even with all of that state, federal, local money, still not the best. So it's in terms of Michigan hasn't at this stage seen any major hit to that, but it's being challenged in court, and that the court order did order the DOT not to rescind any funding that was already in the process awarded until that court case plays out.
Thanks, Lauren. Folks, that is about all the time we have. Thank you so much for your awesome questions and for joining us today. I'm going to turn it over to Kathy to say a few words before we depart. Kathy.
Thank you, Jonathan and Ron, Lauren, and Mike for this incredibly insightful conversation, and thanks to the readers for all the questions as well. It was a really engaged and robust one. So we're going to remind you that we're going to be posting this recording of the program on our website and our app and through our social media channels this week. So if you've joined us late or you know others who care about the issues impacting our state, you can access this conversation in those places. And remember to subscribe to our newsletters and follow us on our social media channels. So speaking of Kelly House and whitefish, next month, Kelly will be hosting a conversation looking at the state of whitefish in the Great Lakes as environmental pressures and invasive species put this iconic Michigan fish on the brink of extinction in the lower Great Lakes states, or in the lower Great Lakes. Kelly is spending the summer reporting on this issue and how it's impacting commercial fisheries and how scientists are desperately trying to stave off this collapse. So we hope to see you there. So with that, have a wonderful rest of your day and enjoy this hot summer day and stay cool. Thanks, everybody.